Hello and welcome to Sewing with Sarah. Today I thought I'd tell you a little bit about my favorite tips and tricks for sewing activewear. I really love sewing my own workout clothes and swimwear, and so I thought I'd just share with you some of the things that I've learned over the years that have helped me be successful in sewing those things. So the first thing that I want to talk to you about is tools. When I cut any sort of project, but especially activewear, I do it with a rotary cutter. This is a 45mm rotary cutter, and the difference between a rotary cutter and a pair of scissors is really going to be in the type of edge that you get. So if you cut with a rotary cutter, you're going to get a nice clean edge like this. If you kind of hack away with a pair of scissors, you're going to get a much less clean edge. Something that looks a little bit more like that, something kind of ragged. So I like to make sure that I use a rotary cutter when I cut my activewear fabrics. So that's something that is also just very quick and easy. You can kind of roll it along. These do have, blades in them that are rechangeable or replaceable. So you can unscrew this, take it apart, put in a new blade, and you'll have something that is kind of good as new. So they last a long time. I really like mine. I use my scissors as well, but not to really cut out an entire pattern. Something else that you're going to want to keep in mind when you're sewing activewear is your needles. You're going to want to make sure you have a needle that's for jersey or stretch or ballpoint, that says jersey, stretch, or ballpoint on the needle type. And you're going to want to match the size down here to the thickness of your fabric. So I usually buy like 75/11 needles. These are 70/10, so this is for a little bit lighter weight fabric. It can go all the way up to 100 or so. So, you can really kind of customize that, but I think 75/11, 80/12 stretch needles are generally kind of the best for sewing activewear. And the reason is because the tip of the needle is shaped differently so that it can kind of pierce the fabric without creating a hole, and that's pretty important when you're sewing activewear. Something else that you're going to want to look for is thread. I like to use Gutermann. This is just an all-purpose polyester thread, 100% polyester. You don't want to use like a cotton thread on activewear. You want to make sure to have a polyester thread. It's going to last a long time, be pretty strong. And I just like the Gutermann brand. I feel like it's nice high quality thread, but I've used Coats and Clark before as well. If I'm using my Serger, I'll use like a Maxi Lock or a Maxi Lock Stretch even, which is kind of a stretch thread that comes on a cone that you can use in your Serger. If I'm using that, I usually only use it in my loopers. So that's something that you can get, but if you're just using a sewing machine, a good old stretch needle and some polyester thread will be perfect for you. Something else to take a note of when you're sewing on activewear fabrics is the stretch and the recovery. So stretch refers to how far it stretches, and recovery refers to whether the fabric goes back into shape after it stretches. So activewear fabrics generally, or activewear patterns generally require what we call four-way stretch. And what that means is that it stretches in this direction, and it stretches in this direction. And the pattern will tell you what percentage of stretch is needed for each direction. So if it says, 50% four-way stretch, you're going to want to measure and make sure that 50% would be taking, 4 inches, if this was a 4-inch cut of fabric, and stretch that it would stretch to 6 inches, or 7 inches if you wanted to do something like, 75% stretch or 70% stretch. So, you're going to want to make sure that your fabric has the appropriate stretch and recovery. A fabric like cotton lycra, this is a polyester blend. And polyester blend fabrics, if they're activewear fabrics, especially things like Supplex, which is a brand name of a fabric that's great for activewear, or Tactile, they have polyester or nylon in them, and this isn't like your 1970s polyester. This is a type of fabric that really wicks sweat away from the body well. Natural fibers tend to absorb liquid, so they're not necessarily going to wick as well. You might feel more wet in them than you would in a fabric that's going to wick sweat. I do use bamboo on my activewear tops sometimes because it is kind of antimicrobial. It feels lightweight, but for leggings, I'm always going to prefer, a polyester or nylon blend. Now, some people will sew activewear out of swim fabric. That's not my personal preference. I find swim to be very slippery, so it just doesn't kind of feel the same to me as like a polyester supplex, circular knit type of blend. And there are a lot of terms out there like circular knit or like supplex that are maybe brand names and don't refer to, they're not necessarily exclusive. There can be very similar fabrics that are called different things. Athletic brushed poly is another one. So this is a cotton lycra fabric that I have right here. And you can see that it does not have four-way stretch. So when I stretch it this way, it doesn't really, has a tiny bit, but it's not really going anywhere. When I stretch it this way, it's got some stretch. You can see the recovery is decent, so it's going back into shape when I stretch it that way. But you wouldn't want this for a pair of leggings where you need four-way stretch because you're not going to have that with this fabric. Now this is a cotton interlock. So this is 100% cotton. It doesn't have any polyester in it. And I'm just using it to demonstrate the recovery. If I stretch it, it's got good stretch. You can see after I stretch it out, it kind of remains, it's not really totally going back to its shape. This doesn't have great recovery in this one. So that's not a fabric that you would want to use for something like a pair of leggings that was tight fitting. Something else that you're going to want to keep in mind when you're sewing activewear is the type of stitch that you're using. Now, if you're using a serger, you're going to want to make sure that your differential feed is bumped up, to 1.8, close to a 2.0, depending on your fabric. If you don't bump up your differential feed high enough, your seams are going to look wavy. Now, I did this on a sewing machine because I think a lot of people feel like, well, I don't have a serger, so I can't sew activewear. And that's definitely not true. These stitches were done with a sewing machine. So this stitch on the right is what's commonly referred to as a lightning bolt stitch. And I'll take you over to my sewing machine in a minute and I'll show you what that looks like on the actual sewing machine. But you can see, if I stretch the fabric, it stretches really well. It's kind of like a really narrow zigzag. This one in the middle is a stretch stitch. So it's shown on the sewing machine usually as like 3 lines right next to each other, 3 dashes. And it's got some stretch, not quite as much as a lightning bolt stitch. But sometimes I'll use this for like top stitching, sometimes if it doesn't need too much stretch. This was just done by adjusting a zigzag on my machine and making it narrower. 3-step zigzag. So you can see it's got some stretch, not quite as much as this kind of specialty lightning bolt stitch, but still decent. Now, if you can see, this one got a little wavy. That's because, unlike a serger, a sewing machine doesn't have a differential feed, so it can't make sure that the layers are feeding evenly. The solution to that is a walking foot. So if you have a walking foot for your sewing machine, you would want to use it when you're sewing your stretch fabric. The lightning bolt stitch one did it less, but it's still, you can see it's still got a little bent out of shape. So that will really help. A walking foot kind of grabs the fabric and feeds it from the top and from the bottom, so that really helps feed it evenly through and would eliminate that kind of seam rippling. Now I did these two to demonstrate that some sewing machines might have a stitch that looks very much like kind of a serger finished edge, or is kind of a cool decorative finish. So this is kind of like the faux like serger stitch here. And then this was just a decorative stitch on my machine. And you can see it has pretty good stretch as well. This is an option for top stitching a pair of leggings or hemming a t-shirt. If you don't have a cover stitch machine and you don't want to just use a zigzag to hem, some of these decorative stitches might be a good option. If you're finding that your fabric is really thin and having a hard time, sometimes something like wash away wonder tape can help stabilize it, or some knit stay tape, or even some steam-a-seam to light is another thing that you can use to help stabilize fabric, especially something really lightweight when you're hemming it. But this fabric did pretty well. This is a fairly lightweight athletic knit. This is something I would use for tops. So I'm going to take you over to my sewing machine now, and I'm just going to point out the types of stitches that I would use. And then I'm also going to take you over to my serger, and I'm going to show you on there how I'm adjusting my tensions and stuff for sewing activewear. So I'm going to do that, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I'm over here at my sewing machine, and it's kind of fancy. It's got this touch screen, but you don't really need all of that. I'm going to show you what some of these stitches were. So when you look at this stitch that I had right here on the edge, the one that stretched the best is the 1-06 here. That's what the lightning bolt stitch looks like. And that one had some really good stretch and recovery. This one in the middle is what we call the triple stretch stitch, and that is 1-05 right there. And then this zigzag was just done by taking my regular 3-step zigzag and shortening the length. I think I had it at 0.9, and also the width. And you can experiment with that on your own and just kind of see what that results in, but I think those are about the settings that I had when I did this. Now these specialty stitches are kind of on this other tab in my sewing machine, and those were you know, this stitch right here, or this stitch right here. So if you have something that looks like that on your machine, or just kind of play with what you do have on your machine, if you have something that has some options for some specialty stitches, that's what I'm using. But so I hope that that's helpful for kind of giving you a visual about what stitches you would use. If we go over here to my serger, you can kind of see, you know, where I've got some of my tensions, and this is really going to change even if you have the same kind of brother serger that's the cheapie on Amazon. You know, your tensions may be slightly different. I find it really changes depending on what thread I've got. But over here on the side, you've got your differential feed over here. So this is what I tend to bump up with really stretchy fabrics. The stretchier, the higher I usually have it. And then over here we have the stitch length and the stitch width. And I usually keep those, you know, right in the middle. So right at that 3, right at that 5, right at their kind of regular settings. Now in my cones, you know, I just have my maxi lock. Sometimes I'll use something like woolly nylon or maxi lock stretch in this upper looper here. But you know, you don't need it. It just adds a little bit of extra, whoops, it adds a little bit of extra stretch on there. So that's what I've got in there. I'm gonna take you over to my Coverstitch machine so that you can have a look and see what I've got going on here. So this is my Coverstitch machine. When I have it set up for top stitching, I'm using all 4 threads. I'm using 3 needles and then the looper. And this is the baby lock Coverstitch, and you can see I have all 3 needles in there. This also has a differential feed, and I usually bump that up, you know, when I'm sewing a stretch fabric. And then I have, you know, my tension set pretty much, you know, at 4, 3.5 across the board. I think, let's see, oh, my daughter must have messed with this one. So, you know, that's just, if that's helpful to you, you know, this machine has just been really well behaved. I really, really love it. But I hope that that's helpful. You know, you just keep in mind you really don't need a specialty machine. You know, your regular sewing machine should be able to do the job. If you have a zigzag stitch, you know, or even better, a lightning bolt stitch, you can sew activewear. And those seams don't need to be finished. A serger will finish the seams, but you don't really need to finish the seams because activewear doesn't fray. So I hope that this has been helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions. Sewing activewear is really fun, and I hope that you have a good time. Just grab some high quality fabric and give it a try. Happy sewing!